Welcome to A Common Future, a podcast that presents ethical, sustainable and creative ideas about how we might live and work in a post-pandemic world. I'm your host, Jerath Head, and today I'm talking with Dr. Tony Matthews. Tony is an award-winning urban and environmental planner with portfolios in academia, practice and the media, and he is a member of the Cities Research Institute at Griffith University. You might be familiar with Tony as the co-host of the award-winning Urban Squeeze program on ABC Radio Gold Coast. Tony joins me to discuss the many planning considerations that cities and urban areas around the world are facing in the aftermath of COVID-19, and how the opportunity might be used to develop more inclusive and sustainable approaches. Thank you for joining me to kick off our podcast series for A Common Future, Tony.
Oh, thanks, Jared. It's my pleasure, actually, to be here and a great honour to be the first guest. So thanks so much for asking me, and I'm really happy to be here.
We're obviously going to be spending quite a lot of this discussion talking about the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, since, that is the big planet-sized problem that everyone is currently dealing with. It seems to me that planning, and especially urban planning for high-density cities, has been one of the biggest sources of commentary for people who are considering how the world might be a different place in the aftermath of COVID-19. But I'm wondering if you might be able to provide a bit of context here in terms of planning in cities and more broadly in environmental planning. What kind of changes do things like pandemics or even other mega emergencies bring about generally, and what do we see the short-term and long-term trends being?
That's a very good question. There's a lot to cover there, so I'll try to cover as much as I can without getting too far into it. But suffice to say, as a launching point, a lot of modern urban planning, that's the urban planning that set down the blueprint for the type of planning that we still do, which was really reformulated, particularly in Britain during the Industrial Revolution. There have been different schools of planning and things like that, but commonly the one that would be used in most of the English-speaking world at least derives from the British system. And that has an interesting history going back to the Industrial Revolution. And what was discovered during the Industrial Revolution was that cities were becoming really unhealthy places. People were being crowded together. There was a lot of environmental pollution, and correspondingly then there was an awful lot of human health problems. There was an awful lot of morbidity, early mortality, childhood mortality, that kind of, lots of human health problems. And epidemiologists and others over time began to put together the idea that it was something to do with the nature and the character of how people were living in cities that was causing them to become unhealthy. And over time that led to an understanding of things like waterborne diseases and airborne diseases and how they transmit in certain ways in certain places. And so as the thinking evolved on that translated into new urban planning practice. Particularly, it led to the introduction of much more rigorous building controls and building regulations around things like maximum occupancies and stuff like that. Citywide sewage systems started to go down. Water treatment and management was much more seriously considered. Street widths were widened for access for emergency services. Tenancy buildings had to have fire escapes. And over time then that provided the basis for understanding that there is a fundamental connection between human health and human living circumstances. And we still see that now. And what's interesting is that the health concerns that we have prioritized in the field of planning have shifted over time. We went from just basically keeping people somewhat healthy and alive in the Industrial Revolution through to a more broad-based understanding of a kind of a more wholesome life that involved green space and community infrastructure and neighbourliness, and that sort of was the suburban thing, to have your own little bit of green space. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out many contexts, many countries, many jurisdictions, many cities, how to best bring nature together with the built environment. How do you intertwine nature into the built environment? How many parks do you need? Are parks alone sufficient? Is there a case for lots more urban greenery? So we've started to look at those questions, and in turn they start to raise issues around things like climate change response and climate change impact management and things like that, connecting physical health outcomes with built environments. So there's been a lot of research into, for example, the connection between suburban living, particularly on the urban fringe, and long car commutes and obesity and so on. A lot of interest in mental health outcomes associated with urban planning and urban design, and how people psychologically respond to space. And so here we find ourselves in 2020, and we now have COVID-19, and we start to wonder about our urban form again and what that might mean for human health. And we start looking at things like density. And density is probably an easy or an interesting one to have a think about, because by every measure of planning priority, density was desirable. Particularly in Australia, we have a policy priority here, and it's taken up in all the capital cities, and it has been taken up in all the capital cities for quite some time now, right back to the 90s in many cases, called urban consolidation. And the idea around that is to increase density so that you decrease the amount of suburban sprawl that you have and the amount of edge development that you have, and that in turn supposedly reduces commuting and reduces environmental footprints and things like that. So for the last 20 years, let's say, we've been pursuing this idea of greater densities in urban and suburban settings. And if you have a look at any Australian city, you can see how much it has densified, particularly the capitals, in the last 5 to 10 years. And you can see all of the new apartment buildings and high rises, and even the suburbs themselves are quite a bit more dense than they used to be in many places. But then suddenly we get this COVID-19 thing, and we start to think, well, some people start to think, well, actually, maybe density is not such a good thing. Maybe density puts people too close to each other and increases their likelihood of transmission. But you have a look then at Asian cities, and they've had a much longer history of density. Most European cities have had a much longer history of density. And so you'll see in many of those cases that maybe there's not such a straightforward correlation between density and virus transmission. Some of those countries got away very lightly. Look at Singapore, for example. I know they had a second wave, but the second wave was almost exclusively down to a particular demographic there, which was migrant workers living in less than sanitary conditions in some cases. But in terms of their overall citywide management of COVID-19, they did an excellent job early on, and Singapore is an extremely dense city. China was almost fully reopened 3 weeks after it went into lockdown. I think it's some astonishing figure. We're looking back on it really quickly. And again, we have nothing approaching Chinese densities in Australian cities. I mean, there are cities in China that have more people than the whole country of Australia has. It's like, so it may not be density. Density may not be the issue here. This may not be a good reason to stop doing density in cities. And also, as with all urban development decisions, and this goes for planning in general, you have to try and figure out, and this is a philosophical foundation of planning, maybe I'll leave the point on this, but you have to try and figure out what is the best way to extract the highest level of public good while still allowing private property development rights to exist. If you were to sort of say, well, we can't do density and planning anymore because of COVID-19, if you were to make that trade, then you'd have to be very well aware of, and you should be very well aware of, all of the other associated problems that will create if you stop doing density. So that'll create a whole bunch of environmental problems straight away, because if you're not intensifying land use, you need more land. There's a problem right away. So then it becomes a balancing act about like human health protection and environmental protection, and it's a negotiation and a trade-off. And again, I think we don't yet have enough data to assess the severity of COVID-19 as a unique factor in terms of causing us to reappraise urban design wholesale, although one thing it has certainly done is it has indicated that people value social infrastructure when they have time to use it. I mean, walking trails, public parks, good street trees for shading, drinking fountains, that kind of thing. I think we've got that message loud and clear.
I guess, is this one of the things that is likely to change the infrastructure design around suburban living? If people who perhaps spend, every day of the week commuting into the city generally are now forced to, well, not forced, maybe as we move forward, it'll be more of a choice and a policy that workplaces take up. But if they're working a day a week, 2 days a week, for example, from home, do you think that's going to result in a greater focus on suburban urban planning and environmental planning, which I'm not sure, maybe it's not the case, but it seems like maybe it wasn't super considered for people spending the bulk of their time during the working week?
It wasn't probably considered. I think you're right about that. I mean, the suburbs have an interesting, there's an interesting evolution there, because like the suburbs have had different life cycles, if you like. I mean, you wind back the clock to the 1960s, 1940s, 50s, 60s, maybe well into the 70s, even the 80s. Chances are most suburban houses had a parent at home, usually the mother. So the suburbs would have been much more busy during the day back then. And then as more and more women entered the labour force, the suburbs started to enter out, and things like childcare and stuff started to take over. So the suburbs got really quiet. And then we started to kind of figure out, well, all these people are on the move all the time. It's creating congestion, it's creating problems, and it's creating traffic, and it's creating stress. And so maybe it would be better if not everybody was trying to get into the CBD, or not everybody was trying to get to focused work locations. Maybe we could have more people working in the suburbs. And so then in planning terms, we spent a long time trying to make that happen. But one of the difficulties with planning is that you can only really provide the scaffolding or the framework for something to happen. You can't actually compel it to happen. So for example, if you want more employment and more high grade sort of professional employment, let's say higher paid professional employment in a suburban setting, you can maybe provide the infrastructure, you can have some supportive policies, you might be able to negotiate a rates reduction or something like that. In partnership with other parts of the council, but you can't make business owners locate there. You can't force them to, and so that was always the problem. We wanted we wanted a more diverse and dynamic and larger workforce in the suburbs than we were able to deliver. But COVID-19 has tipped all of that in its head, because COVID-19 forced us to run an experiment that we would never have run in normal conditions, and of course we all saw that was where anybody really that could work from home was working from home. And so that was a significant percentage of the workforce. And there seems to be a lot of interesting early data coming through from this, that like many companies are finding that productivity is actually up and profitability is up, and that their costs are down because, or at least their costs might go down because they can cut back on rent and things like that. So we were perhaps thinking about the problem in the wrong way initially, which was like, if we provide workspaces, employment opportunities will follow in the suburbs. What we never really considered was like a mass transition to working from home part or full time. I mean, we figured some people would do it, like, you know, there was always going to, like, certain industries will always facilitate working from home a day a week or something like that. But the idea that it would become a recurring thing, we didn't really factor that in the same way that we thought about creating other employment opportunities, which involve physical infrastructure and buildings and so on. So what we might actually see with the COVID-19 thing is that this kind of external event that has sideswiped us and forced us to really scramble for a response and come up with a pretty severe response in a sense, very quickly, and run it in real time with a lot on the line in terms of it working or failing. And I mean that across levels and across scales. It forced us to do that, but we now have some interesting insight. So I suspect that what we'll see more over the next while is people expressing their value for, or seeking to protect the value that they have discovered in working from home, and being more connected to their neighborhood, and having those extra few hours in the week where they're not commuting and things like that. Which has been, I think, one of the big benefits a lot of individuals have had out of the lockdown, was that at the very least they weren't commuting. So that was a couple of extra hours free in the day. And there is a fair bit of evidence out there that links how much time you spend commuting to how likely you are to be socially involved in your community and things like that. Obviously, the more time you're commuting, the less involved you're going to probably be. So this was an opportunity to have a few weeks or a few months for many people of experiencing what an alternative would be like. So I think that for many businesses, there's going to be a business case to keeping some workers at home. For many workers, there's going to be an individual personal case for doing it. I think for many councils, there's going to be a good case for prioritising investment into suburban infrastructure if there's a sense that it will actually be used. Because that's the other thing, you know, you think about social infrastructure in a suburb, chances are it's really only used 2 days a week.
On the one hand, you've got people spending more time in the suburbs during the week and more likely to take advantage of that. But there's also the issue, it seems, that you've pointed out of there might be a case for a number of businesses and for a number of local council investments into that local infrastructure. But at the same time, a lot of people will probably still be plugged in to the cities. If they're working from home, they just won't be commuting as much. And I wonder if does that work against these discussions about more suburban development, or do you think they work hand in hand?
Well, it depends, I suppose, on how long of a time scale we want to take on this. I mean, in the short term, in the next year or so, it's probably not going to make a huge difference. There won't be massive policy adjustments or anything like that. But what there will be certain parts of government or certain parts of public services where there'll be some close attention paid to what's happening. So public transport being a key one. is public transport ridership going to return to what it was, say, 6 months ago or not? And if it doesn't, then why not? And how do you work out future growth trajectories when you have a situation now potentially where a lot of your would-be passengers will not be traveling as frequently? And public transport is based on a sort of a degree of predictability. You have to have some degree of confidence about the numbers so that you can forecast demand into the future and make the necessary purchasing and logistics decisions then to support that. So there could be a few messy years while all of this working from home stuff starts to get ironed out. You know, it might be that a lot of workers would return to the office initially on a full-time basis, but over the following 6 to 12 months, their employer starts to figure out new ways for staff to go home and starts to renegotiate work arrangements and with the intention of reducing office space completely. There might be more hot desks and things like that. So that will play out over time. But that's going to be, you know, that's a kind of a 3 to 5 year thing. But if we find out in 3 to 5 years that like a pattern is starting to establish itself, a discernible pattern is starting to establish itself around people working from home, or a proportion of the workforce working from home, then that does build a stronger case for improving that suburban infrastructure, because now you can point to having users for it. And local governments, local councils are all about business cases. That's their thing. Like, I mean, they love a good business case. They won't do anything without a good business case. And it needs to, in many cases, be a locally founded business case. It's not just kind of, you know, they're not interested in like, oh, well, you know, if you look at the international research, it says, you know, having more public parks is good for these 5 reasons. They need a more local flavor or a more local take on that, you know. So they need numbers and things like that. They need dollar figures. They need usership or ridership in public transport terms, or whatever the case is. So there could actually be, over the 3 to 5 years, there could be, you know, some changes in terms of infrastructure planning, demand and provision. There might be less planning, demand and provision of certain types of public infrastructure and much more for certain types of social infrastructure. That's going to be an interesting one in terms of how that plays out, because you have agencies operating across scales of government, local government, state government and federal government, or in some cases in somewhere like Southeast Queensland where we are right now, you have these kind of regional organisations like TransLink, for example. So it's going to be an interesting one, but the kind of public policy approach to increasing suburban populations and suburban activity during the weeks is perhaps not going to have been as much of a success as what we might find is the private sector policy of pursuing the same, now that they know it sort of works, or can work for some people. You
wrote a piece recently for The Conversation that talked about our relationship to cities in the sense of place, and it seems like in the short term, while, you know, city infrastructure is probably not going to change in any quick fashion, regardless of whether it's a pandemic or not, there's at least a very clear change to how they're being used.
I was being asked a lot about some of the material changes that cities might undertake to respond to COVID. There was a lot of interest, you know, people were asking about things like urban farming and cycling and walkability were big questions, and some of those kind of material changes. And I was thinking and talking about that in a variety of different ways. And the more I thought about it, the more it occurred to me that to some degree I was being predictive. I was saying what I thought would be of value and what I thought people might like. And that's a great mistake that planning has made as a profession for many years, is overestimating our capacity to understand what people actually want. And it led to some very poor outcomes, particularly modernist housing towers in Europe in the 1960s being a classic example of that. Nobody was trying to build dystopia. It happened by accident. People thought they were doing something good, you know. And so I began to think, yeah, well, if I think all of these things should occur or might occur, or there's no scope for them to occur, it's not really about what I think, it's about what people themselves think. Because the more I philosophically thought about the question, the more it occurred to me that, well, the big thing that's happened here, I mean, when you set everything else aside, you set aside all of the statistics around death rate and all, you put all of that aside, the big thing that's happened here is people's sense of the world, or what we call in planning sense of place, has been very disrupted. And in planning terms, sense of place is a kind of it's almost like a psychosocial relationship that you have with a place that's formed through use and connection and memory and revisit and so on and so forth. And so you start to have a warm attachment to places, you have a negative attachment to places, and you know, over time you start to mediate your life in a way that keeps you as much as possible in the places that you resonate with. And so the stuff that we either value or that we were just used to using day to day has to some degree become off limits, and maybe even a little bit sinister. And in tandem with that, then they say it takes a month. It has been said, I've heard it said many times, that it takes a month or so to break a habit. And so if you think about, we've all habituated to our lives, or we had all habituated to our lives, and we've had well over a month now of breaking those habits. So that's also going to change people's sense of place. And, you know, you and I were talking about this without explicitly mentioning it, in terms of, you know, people are experiencing what it's like to cycle around their neighborhood and things like that. So they're in a sense, they're developing a new sense of place, and they're letting go of some of the old ones. And so I kind of thought, well, if that's the case, and that's, you know, probably the case for most people, then really the only way to chart out, in some respects, how to best go forward is to actually is to talk to people themselves, and to try and capture their imagination and their memory and their thinking now, you know, in the near future, and try and go through some meaningful community consultation over the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, taking account of the other changes that occur, like, for example, if the working from home thing starts to become a more common phenomenon. And so over the next year or two, really try and thread out, well, how have people reappraised their relationship to space, and their patterns, and their you know, their priorities. And like, so for example, we could very easily assume that more cycling infrastructure is in high demand. It may not be. The cycling lobby are very good at advocating, but it might be that realistically there's been no real change in interest in cycling long term. There could be, right? I don't know, but my point is, it's not probably a good policy approach, and it's not good planning to assume that we know any of this, and and never assume that you can read somebody's mind if you're making public policies. So what I was saying is, like, let's really get a sense of what people actually do think, feel, and prioritize before we make the big decisions, because they certainly don't think, feel, and view the world the way that they did 6 months ago. That's for sure.
Are there any particular models that you have in mind when you talk about this community consultation? Because obviously there's going to be a number of elements to it. You've pointed out that, you know, people in their suburbs have different ideas about what they need depending on where they live, of course. There's also the CBDs where, you know, it's maybe less to do with people that live there and more to do with business owners or people that might go there recreationally or for leisure or for shopping. So I guess, given that this is multifaceted, is there a particular model or a particular example you might have in mind of how that community consultation might play out, and at maybe what level of government?
You know, it's an interesting question because, well, first of all, I mean, in technical terms, I think probably the best approach would be to use online public consultation software and tools, and online co-creation workshops, which are a bit like design charrettes, where you kind of sit down and a bunch of people plugged into a Zoom meeting or something like that, you know, put their minds together and sort of brainstorm, and you've got policymakers there and designers and everybody else, and we try and find a co-create a way forward, let's say. That's very good for like district level design or neighborhood design, community stuff, and it really involves people, and you can do it online. But it's interesting because the Australia's cities are actually are like at the street level really are primarily run by local governments. Now, Brisbane and Gold Coast are peculiar, right? Because they have big local governments that kind of cover the whole span of the city to some degree. I mean, not entirely, but you look at Sydney and Melbourne, for example, and they're an amalgamation of many local governments thrown together into one space. And then a lot of Australian cities have also overshot their initial size or their initial footprint, and they've become metropolitan regions now, and then we don't have metropolitan governments. We have state governments, and then the federal government is a bit hands-off about cities, but, you know, kind of dips in and out over time. So you're kind of like, I guess, at street level, the changes would be made by local governments, but they need to be properly resourced and supported by state government, I would argue, because, like, particularly if they're going to start changing things, changing the way that they do things, if there's going to be a significant change to the planning of infrastructure provision or anything like that. Or if there's new strategic policy priorities around, public health and things like that say the Queensland government want to invest in, and one of the ways that they're going to invest in that is through improving the built environment or whatever, then they would have to link with local government. So, like, what I would say is that the process should probably be led by local government, and most of the implementation will be done by local government, but it needs to be run in firm partnership and support with state governments where possible. Which is kind of how in Southeast Queensland they originally started the regional planning system. That was state governments, local governments, mayors, environmental groups, and community stakeholders all came together and sort of figured out how to put together a system of planning and management that would plan for the betterment of the region, because they acknowledged that issues and problems and so on don't stop at local council boundaries, and sometimes they go much further than that. So you probably at the street level the work is going to be done by local governments, but you need to have a kind of a zoomed out bird's eye view as well, which takes in firm participation from state government.
And obviously there's the increased complexity, as you've sort of pointed out, and particularly in a state like Queensland where distance and geographical variation just completely changes the considerations and the problems and the overlaps between local government areas. And we might even have to get you back to talk a little bit more about regional planning as something opposed to the sort of more urbanized areas. One of the interesting things at the federal level, which you also wrote a piece of the conversation about very recently, was to do with the home builder package, and you pointed out that you thought it was a missed opportunity. Now, the home builder package, of course, is the government's announced grants of up to $25,000 for people to do renovations and new builds on their homes. I was wondering if you just wanted to give us a quick explanation about what you thought the opportunity that was missed with that package was.
Yes, so the home builder package, which was announced by Treasury late last week, so would have been the first week in June, was designed to stimulate the residential construction sector by providing cash contributions to people who were purchasing new homes or commissioning new homes, or also people who were undertaking renovations. And the idea being that, if you give those people free money or more money, it'll allow them to do more work, and therefore they'll employ more tradespeople. And now it's interesting because I've had renovations going on in my house, and I've had tradies around all the time, and I've asked a bunch of them about home builder, and none of them have any warmth towards it. They don't think it's going to be any help.
Interesting.
That is interesting. Now I didn't break it down with them, but in the couple of quick conversations I've had with them, they don't really feel like it's going to be much help. It's kind of a situation like every company and every tradie is on their own at the moment. If you're with a good company and they're busy, you'll be okay. If you're an in-demand subcontractor, you'll be okay. But for many others, you're not going to necessarily be okay, and home builder isn't going to save you, My criticism of it was that I felt there was an opportunity to pick up a number of free benefits without spending any more by better engineering the scheme. And particularly what I suggested was it was a really good opportunity to encourage a higher standard of building performance and energy performance, building environmental performance and energy performance in both new builds and renovations, just by writing a couple of lines of regulation into it. So, for example, it would have been very easy for the government to say the home builder new home grant is only available to new homes that are certified as performing between 5 and 7 stars according to the Green Building Council rating tool. And it's not hard to do that, right? Like a 5-star home is not that hard to do. We have plenty of prototypes out there now, it's not really that difficult. So it would have been a relatively straightforward task. It's not like you'd have to send the whole construction industry out for retraining or anything, because most of them you're just using the same materials in a slightly different way. Designs are a little different, not a big deal. We're not talking about like tire homes or something here, or earth modules. But you could have written, I would have said government could have written that in there, because that does a few things, for example. So that ensures that, first of all, the developers are the ones that have to respond to that. right? Because if developers don't respond by producing the stock that's eligible for the grant, then their potential customers can't get the grant, so they lose the customers. So you make it a development industry obligation, not a customer obligation. That's the first thing. Second thing is, if you're going for better energy efficiency, you're going to improve the operational potential of the building, and therefore you're going to reduce the operating costs, which is a big issue for people, because things like electricity bills around space heating and space cooling are very, very high for a lot of people. It's hundreds of dollars a quarter to keep your place hot or cold depending on season. Again, good insulation, good design standards, good building standards, the right use of materials. You can get rid of a lot. You can design out a lot of those problems. If you're going to be building to a higher standard, you're also going to need materials that are maybe a little beyond what would otherwise be required. So there's going to be some new manufacturing obligations coming along. There's going to be some new opportunities. You could write in a regulation there that, a certain proportion, at least half of the materials, have to come from Australian suppliers. You could have sort of, the argument I made was that you really could have inserted, with the insertion of a couple of lines of regulation, you could have greatly increased the performance of the buildings that come out of this or are renovated through this. You could have widened the job opportunities. You could have achieved much better energy and environmental performance at the building scale, and also potentially at the larger scale, because if you do enough of these places. And you would have also had an opportunity there to create some other industries like sustainability, well, not create, but stimulate some other industries like sustainability assessment industries, building energy regulations and ratings and things like that. You require professionals to do that. So if you're going to have a house, you're going to say a house is a 7-star standard, it has to be signed off by somebody. So again, you've got you've got another opportunity to stimulate an industry.
Do you think there was also a missed opportunity for, I know one of your areas of interest as an urban and environmental planner is in climate change adaptation. Do you think there was a missed opportunity for some sort of stimulus around better designing for taking into account the impacts of climate change, or is that getting to another level of complexity?
Well, this would have done that probably, because and again, the impacts of climate change are different depending on who you're talking about, where they live, in what city, in what country they're in, what climate zone they're in. They're different. But, for the most part, the two big the biggest environmental hazard around climate change, the one that causes the most problems in Australia, is excessive heat. That's a major public health problem in Australia. Most people don't realize that, but it is. Kills more people. Heat stress kills more people annually than all natural disasters put together. But it's a silent killer, so we don't see it and we don't think about it. It doesn't have the visuals that you get with some of the other stuff, So,
sure.
So that's the first one. One of the you've got a double edge here, right? Because as the climate is getting hotter, your home is potentially getting hotter. And for many people, if it's not well built and well insulated, the only way to cool it down is turn up the air conditioning, which is then producing more greenhouse gas, which is ultimately making climate change worse. So if you improve the efficiency of a building around heat, you reduce the amount of heat stress in the building because you've got better insulation and things like that, which in turn reduces demand for technological solutions to space cooling, or maybe gives you the opportunity to shift away from air conditioning to ceiling fans. And therefore your greenhouse gas profile is lower. The other thing is that you can, it would be easy to stipulate a certain provision of solar PV panels on some of these places, for example. So, if you can run all the air conditioning you want if you've got enough solar panels, because you're just producing electricity on the spot anyway. It's got a far lower pollution profile attached to it. So again, by addressing an energy and environmental performance in buildings, you are actually addressing both sides of the climate change problem in a variety of ways, because, well, where does climate change come from, and where is it most likely to be impacted? If you look at it as a 4-piece pie, one of the pieces is the built environment. It's cities and buildings.
I was just wondering before we finish, though, given there's so much information flying around, so much being written, if you might have things that you might point people to who are wanting to learn more and understand more about some of these issues.
For sure, yeah. A really great resource for anybody, and anybody that's just broadly interested in cities or planning or urban questions at all, is just go to the Conversation website, conversation.com/au, and look at their cities section. They have a cities section there, and it's all 800-word articles written in plain language by people like myself who work in the industry, particularly on the academic side of it, and who translate our research findings and discoveries into articles that not only explain what we discovered, but also why it's relevant. And there's a lot of really rich reading there and easy reading. It's not dense stuff. It's not written in academic language, but that's a really good place. And that same place, the city section of the conversation, has been a really, probably, I think globally, I think the premier place where the discussions around COVID response have taken place. I mean, there's been many of them across the media, but like concentrated in one location, the conversation city section is where it's at. Particularly it's so dynamic at the moment. I'll do a bit of self-promotion, if I may, and say, we did a show on the ABC a couple of years ago, 28 episodes of a show called The Urban Squeeze, which talked about urban issues thematically. So we did different things, different weeks. Each episode's about 15 to 20 minutes long. They're all archived on SoundCloud on my account, Dr. Tony Matthews, and also on my YouTube page, again, Dr. Tony Matthews. You'll find them there. And they talk about, like 28 episodes, each one different, on different things to do with cities. So anything, if you're interested in like, why do cities want the Olympics? We covered it. Where are cities going with renewable energy? We covered it. Everything really, even remote working. We did remote working, teleworking back in 2017. We did a whole episode on that, well ahead of when it became a thing. So you could have a look at that. It's called, as I say, The Urban Squeeze on either my SoundCloud or YouTube page. And then if you really want to take a deep dive, just one other thing that I would recommend, and this is, like heavy enough reading, but if you're very interested in kind of the history of urban planning and urban development, a book called Cities of Tomorrow by a very famous author in our field, Peter Hall, is a pretty dense and weighty tome, but is considered to be the one of the major texts that covers off a lot of this, and particularly why planning has done the things that it has done, including around public health over the last century or so. So that's another good one to perhaps have a look at.
Great. We'll definitely encourage everyone to follow some of those up, and we'll provide some links, especially to the conversation pieces and the ones that you've written. But for now, we might have to leave it there. And can I just say thank you so much for joining me for this discussion. And it's been really interesting, and definitely shines a light on a lot of the considerations that are going to be happening over the next, years, but it's in the short term in particular.
My pleasure.
A Common Future is a digital media channel that contributes engaging writing, film, and audio which considers ethical, sustainable, and creative approaches to living and working beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. Take a look at acommonfuture.com.au.